Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be discussing some potential trades that the Jaguars could look at in the 2024 NFL offseason. So I've got 5 for you. 2 of them are going to be players that are currently in Jacksonville that I think could get shopped this offseason. 3 of them are going to be targets outside of the team. So those are going to be our conversations. And I want to apologize in advance if my voice sounds off at all or I'm breathing heavy and stuff. I had really bad allergies this week, but I still want to get this out for you guys while we have the time. So just bear with me on that if you can. So let's go ahead. Let's jump into it with the guy on the thumbnail, Courtland Sutton. So I have trades marked as this could happen and then unlikely but possible. And so I don't think any of these are more likely than not. I'm just going to be straight about that. It's really hard to predict when a trade is going to happen and if a player is even going to be available. Like last year, I was incredibly lucky to even bring up the topic of Ezra Cleveland to the Jaguars a couple weeks in advance. Like, the chances of that are very minor. I mean, no one even knew he was being shopped. So this is all guessing. We're trying to look at situations with players who we think might go, trying to find possibilities as to what could happen. And so there is a lot of projection involved. But I have those two parameters listed for these because I think some of them makes sense. I think some of them are maybe a little out of the box, a little too much. So Courtland Sutton is the first one. If we're talking about trade value, I think he probably lands somewhere in very early day 3, maybe even potentially your third rounder, and that would be the compensatory third rounder. So Sutton, I mean, if you know anything about him, it's his ability to have some of the most ridiculous catches you ever seen. He signed a deal where I think he's earning about $14 million a year right now. So there's a bit of a cap hit there. Nothing too insane, though. It is a little bit below Christian Kirk. But you look at the situation for the Denver Broncos. They're probably going to be about $16 million over the cap. They have no incentive to release Russell Wilson as well, so there's no money that can be saved there. If they release him in 2024 versus 2025, there is absolutely no change in the cap. He's basically a free player this year for the situation they're in. And obviously it costs $50 million, but what I mean is there's no incentive, there's nothing they gain from cutting him unless they think they're just that much better off having him outside the locker room. So that's the situation they have with Russell Wilson. And they've got some players I think they want to bring back. I think Lloyd Cushenberry be a primary example of that. But I just get the feeling from this team they have to move on from some players, and they're going to have to rebuild for a bit. It's going to be, I think, probably 2 years at least until they're super competitive. And by that point, you look at like Courtland Sutton, and he's probably, like 31 then? And I don't know how much longer he's going to be playing at an incredibly high level. Not that he's, an elite receiver right now, but I don't know if he really fits their vision for the future because of how long it might take to get that team back to where they should be because they made a very bad trade. So they can restructure money and all that. I just don't think they do that. I think they're going to reset. I think they're going to try to prepare for the future. I think they're going to go draft a quarterback this year. And so they probably like to keep receivers ideally, but I don't think Sutton is going to be there when this team has a chance to go finally compete. And so now we go back, we look at, the trade deadline. Look at the competition there was, because this is not a new topic. This is one that's been around for a little bit with him. There was not much competition. I mean, people wanted to go in thinking it was a fire sale, that the Broncos just had, no incentive to keep these players, that they just got to get rid of them, get whatever they can, and that teams were going to get a ton of bargain shopping done. And so Denver ended up taking pretty much no trades at the trade deadline. Actually, I don't think they had a single one because you look at what they were offered, it just wasn't good enough. So do I think there's going to be a ton of competition for him this offseason? I don't know. I think maybe it's a little more. But I think this is a really valuable trade if you're going to go out and try to trade for a receiver. Now, this also projects some things, right? Like, I don't think you do this if Calvin Ridley walks. I don't think you want to spend absurd amounts at receiver. Because you think if Calvin Ridley comes back, say he's paid, just throw out like 21 million a year. Christian Kirk gets 18, Courtland Sutton gets 14. You're talking about how much money then? Probably like well over 50 million for your receiving core. And that's a lot of money to not have an elite wide receiver one on the team, at least right now. So I don't know that Jacksonville does this if Ridley ends up staying with the team, but if he does walk, this would be a move that would make sense because I do think it's affordable then. You get someone who's clearly shown that he can step up in the big moments for his team, and he's going to fit really well in Jacksonville to be able to do that and maybe flip some of those moments that Jacksonville fell in last year, in contrary to 2022 when they were consistently coming out on top. So those are my thoughts on Courtland Sutton. I think it's one that could definitely happen depending on how things go. I think he's a receiver that would project pretty well to Jacksonville's offense and be a good fit with Trevor Lawrence. Now, we're going to go to a player that could leave Jacksonville, and that's Walker Little. This is a trade, I think out of all these, the one that I think is the most likely. And we'll see what team he goes to, but I see a lot of reasons as to why the Jets would want this and why the Jaguars might want this as well. I don't think the Jaguars as a team are as high as the fans have been on Walker Little. And I know the fans have cooled off a bit after the last half of 2023. But Walker Little, when he started, he's looked pretty good. I mean, he's looked fine out on the field. Like, we've constantly talked about, like, why are you paying Cam Robinson all this money if you got Walker Little here? But last year, when Walker Little moved into guard and they tried to force him into that position, they're trying to force a square peg into a round hole, he was bad. He didn't play well. And then when they put him back outside, still wasn't playing well. So I just think, like, for the team, they weren't that high on before because every opportunity he's had to finally, like, take that next step, be the starter, there's no one else to compete with, he hasn't won the battle. He battled against Cam Robinson. He battled against Jawan Taylor. He lost both of those. He could have been the right tackle going into 2023. The Jaguars opted to draft Anton Harrison. It just has not happened. I don't see how it's going to happen this year, and I don't see how he's going to stick around past this contract because another team's going to look at that and say, look, he's been okay. Like, when he's out on the field, he's been fine. We can pay this guy, $2 million this year. We potentially have a starter. We at least have a really good backup. That's a good investment. And what team would make more sense than the New York Jets? Because the Jets know the cost of not having good tackle play. They lost their quarterback on the fourth play of the season after one of the craziest off seasons, most hyped up periods in their history. And so if you're going into this next year, you're doing everything you can to make sure that that is solid. So I think Walker Little makes a ton of sense for the New York Jets because they can get that player that if he's got to start, he can start. I don't think he's going to get anyone killed necessarily. I know he had the one play against Cincinnati where he did get pushed back into Trevor. That is a little fluky. Like, he's been fine throughout his career. I think they would like the idea of that. And I think this is a trade where they would send something like this. I think they could send 144 because is a backup that could be a starter that's going to be cheap for you this year and has experience worth what is an early 5th round pick? I think it is. I think it absolutely is. And then the Jets are not a team that is focusing on the long-term future. They're a team that's focusing on now because that's what they've put themselves in the situation of. They have to win while Aaron Rodgers is there. So I very much like the idea of this trade with the New York Jets. This would definitely be the one that I think is the most likely of these scenarios. Now we'll go to our third trade. And this is the one I probably did the most research trying to figure out. And there's a lot of projection involved with it. I have Jevon Holland out of Miami. And this is a lot of capital, right? Like, we're talking about safety. I get that. And you're moving back from 17 to 21. You're giving up your second rounder. But get this right. Jevon Holland is a hell of a safety. And he would be phenomenal as a pairing with Andre Sisco. This would be probably right off the bat the best safety duo in the NFL, right off the start. So, talking about this trade, I think there's a little bit of logic to it. And you have to kind of put a lot of things together to get to this point, right? But it all makes sense when I think about it. And you guys can debate it with me. That's completely fine. It may not happen. We never know what teams do. But I think there's logic to this. And so here's the logic. I think heading into the offseason, Miami was $54 million over the cap. Some of that goes away because the cap space increased so much, so they're more like $40 million now. But they've got players like Robert Hunt, Connor Williams, they've got Christian Wilkins, all these guys that are going into their first free agency, really, other than Connor Williams. This would be his second time, I believe, because he originally played with Dallas. These are impact players for Miami. Players that they need to bring back if they can. And if they bring them back, well, they're not going to have a fun time next offseason either. Not going to be a lot of money then, even with the cap space going up. So, do I see a scenario where they don't get him back and then they say, oh, but we'll pay Jevon Holland? Even though Jevon Holland's a really damn good safety, I just don't think they do that because it's a safety. They'd rather pay Christian Wilkins, 24, 25 million than pay Jevon Holland like 17 or 18 or wherever it ends up being. It might be even more than that. So, while he's a really good player, this is one that makes sense to me because he just finished his third year. He was not a day one pick, so he does not have the 5th year option. He's got 1 year left. You want to talk about the franchise tag? That might be an option, right? They could get him for a good deal. Well, what happens if Tua goes out this next year and he looks better, which I think is very much possible. Like we saw this even with Daniel Jones where he did this, but he comes out and plays better to the point where it's like, we can't move on. Like we have to see one more year, and you don't want to fall into the Daniel Jones route where you go pay him for 3 and then you just regret it because he's just not as good as what he was now that he's earned the money. Not trying to imply that Daniel Jones is some terrible person that just won money and then he's like, oh, peace out, screw the Giants. Like, I'm not saying that, but that's the way it ended up working out at the end of the day. And so I think Tua is kind of tied to the success of Mike McDaniel as well, because what happens if you have to get another quarterback now? I think you have a really short leash. You've got players who are going to leave during that development period that are really important. So I think they've got to plan for the future to where Jevon Holland, if they're going to keep him, they have to pay him. And I don't think they have the option of the tag. If they pay him over guys like Christian Wilkins and Robert Hunt, that's really questionable to me. That's a very hard decision. So if you're going to try to get something out of him, you either let him hit free agency, you get the 3rd round comp pick, or you get far more, trading him either this offseason or at the trade deadline before that, free agency period hits where he just walks for little to nothing. Because that also handicaps the Dolphins. They can't spend in free agency. If a player like that falls, goes to another team, gets paid a bunch, you don't get it if you spend a lot of money too. So I think Holland is someone who ends up getting shopped this year. And that is, like I said, purely projection. But I feel like there's a lot of things that go together for that. So now why does Jacksonville fit? Well, there's 2 reasons. One, I look at how good of a player Holland is. Like, he's been incredible for Miami. One of the highest grading safeties in the NFL on PFF. And you can see it when you watch him on film. Great player. He projects really well to Nielsen's defense. I think he has the aggressiveness that he's going to look for. And this is a guy who can just fly around the field. So that's all really important. The other side of this is Antonio Johnson. I think it's possible that even though Johnson played really well when he started this year, and he really didn't start much. I mean, he didn't have a lot of snaps, maybe like 100. I'm just guessing on that, but it was not a lot. He did really well, but I don't know if Jacksonville's super high on him. They clearly didn't understand the hype that the fans and the media had when they were asking him about Antonio Johnson after the draft, They do view him as a safety. That is the important thing. But he did play a lot in the slot this year. Maybe they say, hey, this is actually a slot player. Or they say, this isn't the kind of guy that's going to stop us from getting an incredible player like Jevon Holland. So is it possible? I think it is. I think this is a player that Jacksonville would look at. Then you look at the cost. I think Jevon Holland should probably go for an early day 2 pick, like very early, maybe even a fringe first rounder, and getting something small in return. So if that's the case, how does Jacksonville fill that? I think they send 48. So you get a second rounder, but it's not high enough to where I think like Miami wants that. And so you might consider flipping from 17 to 21. This is a very deep draft class. There's a lot of options. I do like 17 a lot more, though, because I think that there's the possibility an elite player falls there that should have been gone early because there's so many names there. But I think this is a deal that the Jaguars would absolutely consider. So, like I said, tons of projection. But I want to throw out one to you that might be a little crazy just to show you that this stuff, like, comes out of nowhere. We just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, like I said at the beginning of the video, Ezra Cleveland. No one was talking about him. I only made a reference to him as a potential option. I didn't even think he was getting shopped. So, we just don't know what's going to happen. And so it's possible you get a player like Jevon Holland who gets thrown to the mix that people just aren't expecting right now. So there's the crazy one. Now we're going to go to final player for trading away and the final player for bringing into the team. So the final guy I trade away that's potential or has potential to happen is Darious Williams. To me right now, this is like 50-50 whether it happens. Because I just don't know how the Jaguars see him projecting to the new scheme. What I mean by that is I don't think it's crazy that he does. I just don't know how they view it. I don't know if they like him in the new scheme. I don't know if they see him as a zone cornerback that can't really do that. The other factor is his age. He's turning 31 this year. He may already be 31. So that's a pretty big deal because that's the specific age where cornerbacks start to fall off. So you combine all these things, and just for some numbers on zone coverage and man coverage, according to PFF, Williams was the number 5 ranked zone coverage cornerback at the end of the season among starters. When you look at man coverage, he was the 25th ranked cornerback among all starters. So there's clearly a big disparity. I think he can play both, but you are going to probably have him not play as well as he did this year because this was a really good scheme for him. And so the argument for trading him is that right now, this is the highest value that he will ever have as a player on the trade market because you have someone coming off a career year who was a top 5 cornerback in zone coverage. There are teams that run a lot of zone coverage that are very competitive right now that need help at cornerback. And so you look at all that, you look at the contract as well. He is paid $11 million this year. That's effectively the salary he's earning. You have $500,000 more on that, which is money that's been paid out before. That's just on the books this year. But for another team, they're paying him $11 million, and that's like just over half of what an elite cornerback is paid. So you see the value, right? Why would a team like Detroit or a team like San Francisco, where both of them run a ton of zone coverage, both of them need help in the secondary, and both of them are trying to win a Super Bowl right now? This is their window. They have to go get it done now. Why would they not be interested? I could not imagine a scenario where those teams, at least one of them, would not be interested in a player like this. So I've looked at like what the trade values kind of looked at. I've seen like 96, 98, like around there is kind of the range. I think it's higher because this is an impact player for another team, someone who's going to come in and be a really good starter. So I think one of those teams sends you something like 73 for Darious Williams. And so, like I said, 50-50. I don't know what happens. I love Darious Williams being on this team. He's a phenomenal player and one of my favorite guys to ever come to Jacksonville. But I wouldn't fully blame them if they look at this and say, we got to get something out of it before we move on. So those are my thoughts on Darious Williams. There is one more player I could have mentioned in this as far as trading away from Jacksonville. I just want to hit on this really quick so I at least get my thoughts out there. That's Josh Allen. I am not going to entertain the idea of it being good to trade Josh Allen. I don't want to talk about it on the channel unless I absolutely have to. I am personally a little concerned that could happen because we do have the rumors about Danielle Hunter still being like top of Jacksonville's free agency list. I mean, they have been the most heavily linked team to Hunter by miles. If they pay him, what's going to happen? I mean, it's possible that Josh Allen gets traded in that scenario. I don't want to see that. I want to just ignore it unless I have to talk about it on the channel. You can see my thoughts on Twitter about it here and there as we see things, but it's just not one I want to entertain because I think that kind of move, even if you argue like, oh, well, Danielle Hunter's just as good of a player and we could get 2 first-rounders out of Josh Allen, like best case scenario, right? And it's possible. I think you blow up the locker room doing that. And I think that's the kind of move that basically signs the death warrant for the front office. I don't think Trent Baalke has any chance of sticking around to the next season if he does that. And I think that's a stain on this franchise for a long, long time. So maybe that's a bit of an over-exaggeration of it. I don't feel that way personally. Those are my thoughts on it. So I don't really want to entertain that too much, but is it possible? Yes. I just hope to God it does not happen. So let's finish up that conversation there. But the final guy in another very improbable one, but I'm going to hit on one more time. I know I talked about him in the last video. You won't hear too much more from me about it until the conversation's ready to be rehashed. That is T. Higgins out of Cincinnati. Like I said, very unlikely, but I think it needs to be discussed because the Jaguars front office is on the hot seat this year. Don't get it wrong. Whether or not you think Trent Baalke's like immune to everything or not, like the reality with the way Jacksonville's done things, they give you a lot of chances and they don't make decisions until they absolutely have to. If the Jaguars are not successful this year, which I will be honest, I don't think they will be. That would be my projection right now. I think the front office gets fired. And so to be successful and to get something to happen, maybe you go make a move like this. When I honestly, I don't think you have to. Like, I think you just wait it out. Like, you wait until next offseason where the tag goes up drastically because it is going to be over $26 million if Cincinnati wants to keep him the next year and get some trade value out of him. I don't know if they sign that because this is a cheap organization. Other than the Joe Burrow deal, they have an entire history of being this way. So I don't think they franchise tag him next year. I think you could get him then, but Baalke might not be here next year. Maybe he sees this as a move he has to make. So under the theory that they would consider a move like this, Higgins would be an incredible fit to Jacksonville. There's a lot of substance to fans talking about this, to them wanting him here. It makes a ton of sense. He's an incredible fit. The Bengals could move on possibly this year before the trade deadline. You know, what happens if they've got too many injuries? What happens if they can't compete? And we see them have bad starts to almost every single season. Even when Joe Burrow's been there, like every year, they start out rough. So it's possible that he gets shopped. Well, they can get something from him. So I think it's possible he hits the market. But if you're talking about what they got to give up, I think they have to get a premium pick in return. And so I look at it like this. Higgins, I don't think he's worth 17, but I think 48 is way too low. So you have to find a way to combine picks. So you're either, giving up maybe 48 and a third and a fourth and something in the future, or you give up 17 right now, but you get a pick on day 2 in return. And I think that's where the value would fall. I think if we saw a trade for T. Higgins, this is what it would be. That would be my bet right now. And I don't think that's terrible for Jacksonville. I just think that you wait it out. If you have certain scenarios where I don't think you really consider this, but say that Calvin Ridley walks and he's not back on the team. Can't pay him enough. Another team offers him more. He's gone, right? Say you go into the draft. Maybe you get like a Jevon Baker who would be a solid starter, but you don't get one of the elite receivers. Then you're absolutely considering something like this in the future because you have that need there. You have Christian Kirk, and then you have, Jevon Baker, whoever it is, and whoever the other starter is. So you clearly have a need then. And I think that's the best way this works out. But is it possible Jacksonville gets very, very desperate? Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. So those are my thoughts on T. Higgins. Unlikely, but possible. So just to wrap this up again, what do I think actually happens? It's hard to project trades, but if I had to guess on these, I think the Jaguars, I would actually think they trade Walker Little. I think it would make sense for them if they want to get something in return, and I don't think they believe in him as a starter, and I don't think they really want to just pay him to be a backup. Is that really worth it to the team? Can they pay him enough to be a backup that's going to beat another team who really needs tackle bad into paying him more to try to start? I just don't know if that happens. So I think they trade him. And I think with Darious Williams, it's 50-50. And if it happens, it's going to happen after the draft because they need to know where is their team going to sit heading into next season. If you go draft like Nate Wiggins, then yeah, you're considering trading Darious Williams because, Tyson Campbell is still cheap. I don't think you're trading him right now. He's got a ton of upside. He's going to be around a long time as long as he plays well. But Darious Williams is an older player. You have your opportunity to move on. You have your guy. That's when I think you trade him. But if you don't get someone that you absolutely know can be the long-term starter, say you get like a Cam Hart where it's like some projection there, then I think they keep Darious Williams because they do have to compete this year. You have to make sure that you're safe to be able to move on from him. So that's a trade I think would happen later in the offseason. So those are my thoughts on this, guys. It was a fun video to put together. It took a lot of research on some of these, especially like Jevon Holland, because I tried looking at teams like Atlanta, teams like New Orleans, because New Orleans, tons of cap space they've got to get sorted out right now. They are way over. They've started on it. That would be a place where players would probably come from. I didn't find anyone I thought was too realistic. And then with the Falcons, they had some players like along the defensive line that would be possible, but I don't think they want to let them go. Grady Jarrett would be an example of that, where I almost threw him on this, but I think that's a player they value too much to consider trading right now. And that is an organization that's going to go into win now mode now that Arthur Blank is like 80-something years old. There's not much time left for him to get his Super Bowl. I hope he has a lot of time left. Obviously, I'm not, hoping he dies or anything, but there's just when you're that old, you've got to start winning now. You've got to get it done because there's just not all this time you're guaranteed to have. So those are my thoughts, guys. It was a fun video to put together. Next videos are going to be about the NFL Combine, or they are going to be based around moves that Jacksonville makes. Depends on what comes first. But Monday, expect a video on the Combine. We're going to look at offense. And then Wednesday, we're going to look at defense and get ready for the Combine. Have some reviews. It's going to be fun. I'm excited for it. Those are my thoughts. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.